Professor Rosie Campbell is Professor of Politics and Director of the Global Institute for Women's Leadership, or GIWL, as we call it, at King's College London. Now, I think we've spoken about GIWL before, and as you know, it was founded by Julia Gillard in 2017 and brings together rigorous research, practice and advocacy to break down the barriers to women becoming leaders while challenging the ideas of what leadership looks like. Rosie held positions at Birkbeck and UCL before joining King's in 2018. She has recently written on barriers to participation in politics, gendered patterns of support for the populist radical right, and what voters want from their elected representatives. It's probably honesty and transparency. Her publication covers the subjects of voting behaviour, public opinion, the politics of diversity and political recruitment. Rosie was the principal investigator of the ESRC-funded Representative Audit of Britain, which surveyed all candidates standing in the 2015, 2017 and 2019 British general elections. I think that America needs you, Rosie. She has co-authored reports for the Fawcett Society, the Expert Panel on Electoral Reform for the Welsh Assembly, BBC Radio 4's Women's Hour, the Electoral Commission and the Hansard Society. In 2020, Rosie presented an episode of BBC Radio 4's Rethink series, examining how COVID-19 is accelerating changes to our world that were not expected until at least 2025. And Rosie, welcome, but that BBC Radio 4 series sounds absolutely fascinating, and it's something I think that we're all talking about at the moment. So what are the changes that you found that COVID-19 has dramatically shifted, and how does that relate specifically to women?
Well, we all know that those of us who are privileged enough to be able to work from home, many of us have been in massive numbers. And this accelerated a trend that we had been seeing anyway about large companies thinking about the costs that are implied by the large central city offices and how they could be outsourced, and also thinking about flexibility of staff. So there is a real sense that there could be a massive acceleration because of COVID, that the technology, as you all know, has been available to some extent for some time. And I don't think many of us thought that we'd be able to adapt as quickly as we have, that the various different platforms like this one that we're using would be as effective as they are. Not that there won't, when this dreadful period is over, be lots of important opportunities for face-to-face contact. But actually, there is now research showing during the pandemic that for certain kinds of work, we're more productive when we work at home if we have a suitable working environment at home. So that sounds like, and I think at the beginning of the pandemic, a lot of us thought this sounds like a wonderful opportunity for women, many of whom have caring responsibilities more so than men. Also, another opportunity is the fact that many men had to take up caring responsibilities where they may not have done before. So many men whose partners were worked in critical services, be that as healthcare workers or in the food chain, will have to have stepped in when childcare providers and schools closed, as they did in many countries, and provide that care. So there's a real opportunity for more of a levelling up of that distribution of unpaid caring work between men and women. But there are also some real risks if we don't really inject into the debate a gendered analysis. And I'm sure many of you feel this too. We've been doing some research at the Institute about whose voices have been heard during the crisis. And it's no surprise that it's disproportionately men. And I think one of the risks that really worries me is that we could move towards a two-tier workforce for those of us who are able to work from home. There's a discussion of having lots of organisations are considering, for example, having a much reduced central office and then suburban hubs. Well, that sounds fantastic if it means that all staff have access to the central office when they need it, and then can make use of central suburban hubs when it suits them. But there's also a real danger you might end up with a two-tier workforce, where those who are at the suburban hubs are on 0 hours contracts or something of that nature, pseudo self-employed, and those at the central city offices are those who are going to move into leadership positions. So we really need to be careful that the opportunity that this crisis provides for us in terms of women in work is seized in terms of making sure that there's a gender lens to all these decisions that are being made very, very rapidly at this moment of change.
Yeah, well, I guess we all sort of really felt the impact of not having enough women's voices around decision-making tables when the federal budget was delivered by our Treasurer, and a real omission was the fact that childcare was basically ignored. And it was so disappointing to so many people. I mean, men and women, I have to say, because there was an expectation that childcare, which affects men and women and families, would in fact be reformed in a way that worked so much better for our society. Are you finding the same thing in the UK?
Yes, I mean, I think a glimmer of hope is that there is an understanding amongst a broader base of the public and decision makers that childcare is core infrastructure in a way that I don't think was understood before, because the way things ground to a halt when there was just no childcare provision at all really in the UK sent a very clear message about how absolutely fundamental it is. But I think, unfortunately, the situation we have in the UK with this current government is it is a step backwards in terms of women's inclusion and women's voices. There are very few senior women in our government, and it's a very macho kind of politics that is not going to take these issues seriously in the same. I mean, there's a huge debate going on in Britain at the moment around children who are on free school meals. Yeah. The Prime Minister is being bashed left, right and centre from his own MPs around the fact that they are not going to help those children during the half-term holidays that we're currently in at the moment. So the issue of childcare, the issue of child property is incredibly raw and current, but I'm not very hopeful in the British case that that's going to be resolved in a positive way. I hope you have more success in Australia.
Yes, well, a good friend and colleague of ours had to actually start a hashtag called Credible Women, because when she complained about the budget not addressing women's and family issues at all, she was actually contacted by the Prime Minister's office and told that nobody credible had complained about the budget not addressing women's issues. And so she's launched a hashtag Credible Women, which took off. So you can hashtag Credible Women, and we'll be there supporting you.
Wonderful. Got that down.
Rosie, GIWL is a fantastic organisation, and I've so enjoyed being on the advisory council. And the collaborations and finding ways to work together and other collaborations that you look for. Will you share a little bit with the group about GIWL's work and focus and how that's all panning out?
Well, so as Carol said, the Global Institute for Women's Leadership is Julia's brainchild. She, when she was writing her memoir, reflected very deeply on whether the experiences that she had as Prime Minister, to what extent that was due to the way she came into office, due to the nature of Australian politics, and to what extent was gender. And she discovered a literature out there that wasn't easily accessible, but also gaps in the research. And so our job, our role, is to bring that research to a wider audience, working with others, but also to work to fill those gaps so that we have a better understanding of how gender impacts women's access to leadership and the way women are judged once they're in leadership positions. So we're a research-based organisation, but research into action. We really want to bring the best quality evidence about what makes a difference and what makes a difference quickly into the hands of decision makers, because we want to speed up change. And I think, coming back to our previous point, Carol, there's a real danger now that actually we're going to head backwards rather than forwards. And so it seems to me to be even more important than ever that we really have readily available information for decision makers, so that if they are willing to do the right thing, they can, and that we're there with the information about how to do that, as well as pressuring them to do it.
Yeah. And one of the things that we're very interested in as a group, and that we talk about as alumni, and also in the course, in the Pathways to Politics course, is women in the media, and the treatment of women in the media, or the omission of the media of consulting women. You presented a really interesting report this morning. Would you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, so my colleague Laura has been hiding away in a cupboard for months trying to create this natural language processing tool where we can scrape huge amounts of, at the moment, English language media and analyse it to see whether women are mentioned, whether they're quoted, and then break that down by category. And what Laura's been able to do is look at we haven't published this research yet, but she's just wrapping up, is look at the coverage in Australia, the UK and the US, and establish whether women's voices have been heard in the debate. And it won't be a huge surprise to you that women are underrepresented. About a third of the coverage references women, cites women. But actually, when you break that down by the topic, if, for example, you're looking at STEM, you're looking at scientific experts, of which there are plenty of women in this field, in the healthcare field, you get down to figures off the top of my head, something like 13%. And one of the really interesting things was when we broke the findings down by country, they were almost exactly the same in the UK, Australia, and the US. So this, you would have thought in a crisis like this, where we know that women are disproportionately affected, there would be an effort to seek out, particularly in the healthcare field, women's voices, but that hasn't been the case. Although one caveat is on the issue of domestic violence, women's voices were the majority of cases.
Well, that's the thing, wasn't it? I mean, in the numbers that you presented on the women's issues, there were a lot of women consulted, but women aren't consulted about the things that aren't seen as being women's issues. And these are the things that we're constantly reinforcing with journalists, that actually, guess what? Women can talk about science, and they can talk about business, and they can talk about economics, and they can talk about things other than women's issues, childcare, domestic violence.
And astonishingly, in the UK, the lead scientist for the Oxford vaccine is a woman. So I just don't know how it's possible that the percentage of women in that coverage is so low. I think it's the kind of old Rolodeck. I think one of the issues that happens that I would really encourage all of you to resist. I had the way I got into making these BBC documentaries is the BBC was given a massive kick up the bottom a few years ago because they were using too few women experts. And I entered a competition to be part of this BBC Expert Women training. And when I did that training, one of the things they said is if they call a woman up and say, could you speak about this? They're much more likely than a man to say, oh, it's not quite my area, but my colleague would be good on this. Now, what they said, which I found really assuring, is, draw a bubble around your expertise, and you don't have to go miles out of your bubble. Rent-a-gob is not attractive. Being a real expert is attractive, but push that bubble a bit further than you naturally feel comfortable to. And if you're going to name another colleague, make sure it's a woman. And it really changed my attitude around some of these programs that I'm making now are not in my research area. And I find myself interviewing people that I interviewed Eric Schmidt, the former CEO of Google. I was quaking in my boots. And because it was the middle of the crisis, I was in my daughter's bedroom with a towel over my head when I was speaking to him, because we've got a lot of wooden floors and that creates an echo. It was incredibly stressful, but I thought, I'm so glad I did this. And I think that's something that I would really recommend to all of you. You don't need to be Rent-a-Gob. We've got plenty of those out there, but have confidence about your area of expertise. And remember, if you do make a mistake, you're much less likely to than Rent-a-Gob. So, take a risk and step out there and do it.
I love that. We might do a hashtag Rent-a-Gob.
Don't be that person.
It's very funny. I might use it when I'm criticising journalists for not using women. Why are you using hashtag Rent-a-Gobs?
Yeah.
Oh, that's great. Thank you. Rosie, your work has has focused on areas like voting behaviour, public opinion. And so I'm sure you're avidly watching what's happening in the lead up to the US election. There's so much occurring each day, but to name a few recent events, there's the impressive Kamala Harris pushing back on Mike Pence interrupting her, the recently well-attended Women's March against Trump, and of course, recent polls indicating that the white women voters who supported Trump in 2016 are finally now turning away from him. Really interested in what you make of all of this.
Well, I mean, I'm always slightly cautious about us giving these white women voters a hard time, because if you look back at 2016, there's been a gender gap in every US election since 1980, with more women voting for the Democratic presidential candidate than men. What was odd about 2016 is that gap was about the same as it had been in the previous election. And given Donald Trump is a well-known misogynist, we expected that gap to be bigger. But there was still a large gap, with many more white men voting for Trump than white women. I suppose what astonished people was that a small majority of white women voted for Trump. But that was the case. The small majority of the white women had voted for Republican candidates in all previous elections. So what we were, not all previous elections, in previous elections since 1980. So what we were shocked about was that the Trump effect wasn't greater. And I think if we think back to the vilification of Hillary Clinton in that campaign, I don't think it should be such a shock. You know, many women are not conscious feminists. And if you're being bashed and bashed and bashed of being told that this candidate should be locked up, you know, it shouldn't be a surprise that that really managed to hold the Republican base together to some extent. And I think what's interesting now is that some of those women, despite the continued bias in the US media, which is pretty astonishing, can see for their own eye, with their own eyes, what this man is. And so the gender gap is going through the roof, at least in the polls. I always think wait and see what happens in the final cut, but at least in the polls it's going through the roof. And that gives me real hope, because in this modern world where we consume so much of our media in silos, these women who are being pumped with information to try and push them towards Trump are walking away. So let's hope that works out. I mean, I really try as a political scientist not to be biased, and I don't have a public affiliation to a party, and I have respected all of our prime ministers until this current one. But I'm afraid, I mean, all of us, I mean, Donald Trump is just the most hopeless, misogynistic, racist president, and shame on the democratic world. So I can only hope that those white women do deliver us away from him.
Yeah, it's, you know, I'm just totally perplexed and I guess somewhat disillusioned with the American people that they say that 40% are rusted on Trump voters. I mean, are they living in a parallel universe or what? Can they not see how hopeless he is?
We're living in a massively divided country, and I do think if you look at the US, it's two countries, and there is a real underbelly of America where there's very low education, very low opportunities, where people are being pumped with very sophisticated lies through the media. They don't have. I'm now a massive fan of the press regulation that we have in the UK, which means that something like Fox News cannot operate in that way in the UK. But then now we have these back channels that are not regulated in countries with press regulation through Facebook and so on. I do not blame the people. I think that the democratic processes are supposed, the process matters. And if politicians don't act in a way that helps to, well, not just politicians, all the actors involved have to preserve those processes. And I think there was an arrogance that actually democracy was so strong that we could undermine the fourth pillar of democracy, which is obvious, you know, which is the media, which is journalism, and democracy would survive. And then, of course, the other factor in US politics, which is magnified beyond what we would recognise in our countries, is the role of dirty money. I mean, it plays a role in all politics to some extent. But the way PACs operate in the US, means that the whole political system has been moved so that it's not in the interests of those poor people, but they don't understand that. And that might sound like I'm sort of talking about false consciousness, but I don't think that's inaccurate in this case. I think there's a reason that many of our politicians have had to sit down and sign legislation that has regulated media, which has regulated spending in election campaigns, and that was the morally right thing to do. And it is a moral failure that hasn't happened in the US.
Yeah. Well, I was going to ask you, are you at all worried that something similar could happen in the UK?
I do think that this issue about, if you look back to the EU referendum campaign in the UK, there were proper lies. Now, people, for balance, sometimes journalists say on both sides, and yes, that's a bit true, but the massive proportion of those lies was on the Leave side. And they're able to get away with that because our media environment has changed. And I personally think that we need to speed up in how we deal with social media platforms, people's confidence in quality news outlets has really declined. And I think it's a massive, massive problem. So no, I'm not absolutely confident that what's happened in the US can't happen in the UK. And often to some extent we follow behind. But we do have the rules about spending in election campaigns and donations to candidates and so on, that I think means it's unlikely that we will reach that level. But, I hold my breath.
Yeah. And just one other thing on that. Do you have the sort of lobbying that goes on in the US, but not necessarily at the same scale?
Yes, of course the lobbying happens. And, there are scandals that reach the newspapers sometimes, but you simply cannot, the way that these negative ads are run by a PAC that is officially not part of a party, you just can't do that in the UK. There isn't that legal loophole. And so the politics operates in a different way. The infrastructure, to some extent, even in the social media environment, is still working to protect us from those really. Also, the idea of free speech is very different. You cannot just say whatever you want without there being regulation.
Yeah, yeah. Rosie, I want to talk about your recent report, Women Political Leaders, the Impact of Gender on Democracy, which is based on an analysis of over 500 pieces of research into the impacts of women leaders in politics and public life. Congratulations on that report, absolutely stunning. And it shows that when women are able to exercise political leadership, there are gains not just for women and girls, but for the whole of society. I mean, this is something we talk about, but tell us about your research, because it would be great to be able to quote the evidence.
Well, so this for us really is a kind of a survey of what we know now, and we want to use it as a platform to try and fill in the gaps of where we don't know. And so in the report itself, you've got a traffic light system. From green, the evidence on this is pretty strong, through to red, it's very shaky. And what we do know is where there are more women in politics, you have lower levels of corruption, you have greater spending and investment on social services such as healthcare and education. But obviously, that's correlation largely rather than causation, in that we can't prove it's the individual women leaders who are leading those changes, although we can in some of the issue areas. So if you look at domestic violence, if you look at childcare, then you can see when waves of women politicians enter politics that those issues come onto the agenda. But what's interesting is they tend to bring men on board too after a period of time. They cease to just be women's issues. But, for example, the corruption issue, it may well be that as societies become less corrupt, it becomes easier for women to navigate their way through them, because they're less likely to have those powerful ties and resources that allow them to navigate the corrupt system. So we would really like to do more research which allows us to actually show the impact of the women politicians themselves. But in my view, it makes perfect sense. My former PhD supervisor, this has always really stuck with me. In the 1970s, she was in a room of political scientists, and they were talking about democracy and how you measure democracy. And they had Switzerland in their list of democracies. And she said, well, of course, we can't have Switzerland as a democracy. Women don't have the vote. the men laughed at her. They laughed at her that Switzerland would not be a democracy without women over vote, because that's a secondary matter. And so I think, of course, having more women in politics improves the quality of democracy, because it ain't a democracy if women are not represented in it. But I also think it makes sense that when we have a greater diversity of voices, that actually we see more representative politics. And that's what the research shows, that those issues that were sidelined, that were private matters, violence against women, childcare, become part of the mainstream political discourse when women are present.
Yeah, I always find the argument about correlation versus causation sometimes very frustrating. When does correlation become causation?
If you can show, I think the problem is that a lot of these trends in societies move together. So if at the same time societies are becoming better organised and less corrupt, women are also gaining more access to positions of power, you don't know which is causing which. So I think that is the issue there. Whereas if I always think there's a lovely, just fantastic piece of research that was published quite a few years ago now in Science by Esther Duflo, the now Nobel Prize winner, and colleagues, where they looked at in Indian villages, there had been a randomization where they had insisted on a women leader in some villages and not others. And that's a true experiment, which is very hard for us to do in social research. And what they found was, in the villages with the woman leader, young girls' aspirations, career aspirations raised, but pivotably, their parents' aspirations for those girls changed. They were much more willing to keep them in school because they could see, oh, actually, there is a possibility that this might be economically beneficial to our family, which in a poor family obviously is critical. That's hard causal evidence where you can be sure, because of the randomization, that this is the cause, the women leader is the cause. Otherwise, these other villages are the same. And it's very hard. We've got a small number of cases. It's like the question at the moment, are women leaders leading better through COVID? It certainly looks like it, but there aren't that many of them compared to the men for us to really draw that out in a really systematic way.
Thank you. Now, I know Sarah's going to start flashing me because I have to share the questions now and open up to others to ask questions. So, Sarah, over to you. Rosie, that's been fantastic. Thank you.
Well, it's so nice to meet you all. It's really nice to have causes for optimism at the moment, and to see all of you women who are going to go forward and sort things out really makes me feel much better. So thank you all very much.
So that was just a lovely little taste of normality, and I can't wait till we can have our next in-person event and properly have a glass of wine and a chat with you all. But we really love that you chose to spend tonight with us, and Rosie's just such a fantastic speaker, so I'm sure you've all taken a lot out of that. Carol, do you want to say any final words?
Just great to see everyone, great to have a chat, and thank you everyone for your commitment to the program, for your continuing involvement, and like Sarah, I look forward to having a glass of apple cider because I don't drink wine, and seeing you all soon, sooner rather than later, we hope. And congratulations to all Victorians. We have done an amazing job. We've had a great leader, taking us through in a steadfast and determined way, and we've done what no one else in the world has ever done, and we've got to be really proud of ourselves and move forward with great positivity and optimism.